The old soldier, Elias Vance, had spent years gazing at horizons that promised only dust and conflict. Now, in the twilight of his active life, his gaze was fixed on a different kind of horizon, the faint, shimmering line where the prairie met the endless sky, from which his bride, a woman whose letters were threads of a distant dream, was meant to emerge. His small, isolated cabin, etched against the vast, unforgiving landscape, had been meticulously cleaned, a testament to a quiet, profound hope. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the dry grass outside, was amplified by the drumbeat of his anticipation. He was a man accustomed to waiting, to the gnawing passage of time in desolate places, but this wait felt different, heavier, laden with the weight of a promised future finally within reach. His hands, scarred by saber and rifle, now trembled with a tenderness he barely recognized as his own. The scent of fresh-cut wood, the faint aroma of simmering coffee, mingled with the dry, clean smell of the land itself, creating an atmosphere of contained expectation. This was not the restless vigil of a sentry. This was the quiet, almost painful stillness of a heart daring to believe in solace. He had walked through the crucible of war, seen the brutal face of prejudice, but none of it had prepared him for the raw vulnerability of this moment. The world outside, with its judgments and its bitter memories, seemed momentarily hushed, as if even the wind held its breath for the arrival of something pure. He had survived the battles, but could he survive the fragile beauty of a peace finally earned? This was the silent, rhetorical question that echoed in the quiet confines of his soul, a question that hung heavy in the air, thick with the scent of unfulfilled longing and the distant echo of a forgotten life. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The sun was a searing brand on the western sky when the shadows first appeared. Not the lone figure he envisioned, a woman in a modest dress, but a ragged, stumbling cluster, like a broken constellation against the fiery backdrop. 9 of them. Children. White children. His blood turned to ice, then fire, then a cold, dead ash. His meticulously crafted piece shattered like cheap glass. The future he had so painstakingly built instantly consumed by this impossible, grotesque reality. They were a motley collection of tattered clothes and wide, haunted eyes, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, their small bodies seemingly too frail to carry the weight of such profound abandonment. A baby, barely more than an infant, clung to the skirt of an older girl, whose gaze, shockingly mature, met his own with a desperate, silent plea. How did they come to be here, at his isolated doorstep, so far from any settlement, any semblance of civilization? The question was a sharp stone lodged in his throat, choking the words he couldn't form. This was a cruel irony, a cosmic joke played at the precise moment of his greatest vulnerability. His hands clenched, not in anger, but in a profound, guttural helplessness. His uniform, long since discarded for the simple clothes of a homesteader, felt suddenly too thin, too permeable to the harshness of this new invasion. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the ragged breathing of the children and the distant, mocking cry of a hawk. His cabin, once a sanctuary, now seemed to shrink, unable to contain the immense, unexpected weight of their presence. They were an indictment, a living, breathing testament to a world's callous disregard, dumped onto his barren doorstep like so much refuse. The image of his anticipated bride, her gentle face, her hopeful smile, blurred, then vanished, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of these 9 hungry mouths, these 9 lost souls. His first instinct was to turn them away, to close the door on this impossible burden, to reclaim the shattered fragments of his anticipated serenity. He was a retired soldier, not a goddamn orphanage. His life, hard-won and solitary, had been about shedding burdens, not acquiring them, especially not a flock of unkempt, desperate white children in a time and place where such an act of charity, from a black man, would be viewed with immediate suspicion, if not outright hostility. The irony was a bitter taste on his tongue. He, a man who had fought for a country that still largely refused to acknowledge his full humanity, was now confronted with the ultimate test of it. He watched them huddled together, a small, shivering mass of vulnerability, their eyes a kaleidoscope of fear and exhaustion, fixed on him. Their silence was more eloquent than any plea, a testament to a trauma he could only begin to imagine. He thought of the whispers that would inevitably start, the accusations, the danger that such a presence would bring to his already precarious existence. He had survived too much, endured too much, to invite ruin now. Yet, as he watched the smallest one shiver, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, something shifted within him. A phantom ache in an old wound, a memory of a time when he too had been utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers, or the sheer luck of survival. He grunted, a sound of profound exasperation and grudging acceptance. "Get inside," he rasped, his voice rougher than he intended, echoing in the vast emptiness around them. It was not an invitation, but a command, delivered with the heavy resignation of a man whose carefully constructed world had just been irrevocably, brutally reshaped by forces beyond his control. The simple act of opening his door, a gesture of basic humanity, felt like a concession to an unseen enemy, a surrender to a fate he had desperately sought to outrun. The scent of dust and fear, mingled with the faint, sweet odor of desperation, clung to the children as they stumbled through his doorway, transforming his austere cabin into a chaotic, unsettling space. Elias watched them with a detached gaze, his mind already calculating the impossible logistics: food, water, warmth, and the sheer, unending presence of their need. He had faced down charging cavalry and hostile planes, but the silent, pleading eyes of these children felt like a more formidable foe. He saw himself reflected in their hunger, a familiar ghost from his own past, a time when he was a boy, lean and wild, before the uniform had pressed the softness from his edges. He remembered the sting of a particular lash, the cold emptiness of a night without shelter, the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. Those memories, like shards of broken glass, pricked at the hardened shell he had built around himself. He had learned, through brutal experience, that kindness was often a weakness, and survival demanded a certain ruthlessness. But looking at these small, defenseless bodies, ruthlessness felt like a betrayal not just of them, but of some forgotten part of himself. A small girl, no more than 4, wandered towards his hearth, her tiny hand reaching out to the cold stones, as if seeking warmth from a memory. Her movements were slow, almost dreamlike, burdened by a fatigue that defied her years. He saw in her the raw, unvarnished innocence he had seen extinguished so many times, in so many faces, on so many battlefields. A familiar bitterness, sharp and metallic, rose in his throat. He had spent his life witnessing the endless parade of human cruelty, and here it was, manifesting in miniature, a testament to the world's indifference. He had always believed in a solitary path, a man's journey through a harsh world, relying only on himself. Now, this unexpected burden, these fragile lives threatened to dismantle the very foundations of his carefully constructed, lonely existence. The memory of the Powder River, of the freezing wind whipping at his face, was a cruel, vivid flashback. He had been barely more than a boy, a buffalo soldier, standing guard, watching the swirling snowflakes obscure the enemy until they were upon him. It was a chaotic, brutal skirmish, a blur of smoke and shouts of desperate blows exchanged in the biting cold. He remembered a moment, clear as a bell, when his rifle had jammed, and he was left unarmed, exposed, facing a charging warrior. In that fleeting instant, a white man, a fellow soldier he barely knew, had thrown his own loaded rifle to Elias, a silent, selfless act that defied the pervasive racial animosity of their time. It was a fleeting flicker of unexpected camaraderie, an anomaly in a world built on division and hatred. That man had fallen moments later, a bullet to the chest, his sacrifice echoing through Elias's life as a dissonant chord. He hadn't understood it then, the raw, unthinking altruism that transcended the ingrained prejudices of the army, the country. He had simply taken the rifle, fired, and survived. That moment, a brief, violent interlude, had always haunted him, a stark reminder that even in the darkest corners of humanity, a flicker of unexpected grace could exist. He had never sought to understand it, preferring to focus on the bitter lessons of self-reliance. Now, as he watched the children shivering by his cold hearth, the memory resurfaced, sharper, more insistent. Was this his turn? Was this his moment to return a kindness he had never asked for? A debt he never acknowledged? The thought was an unwelcome intruder, disturbing the carefully ordered chaos of his mind. His hands, still raw from the physical labor of homesteading, twitched, a phantom echo of the rifle's weight. He was a survivor, yes, but what did one survive for? The question hung heavy, a silent indictment against the fortress of his solitude, demanding an answer he was not prepared to give. Word spread, as whispers always do in the unforgiving expanse of the frontier, carried on the very winds that scourged the land. The isolated black homesteader, the former Buffalo soldier, had taken in a brood of white children. The news arrived not as shouts, but as sidelong glances from the few settlers who passed his remote claim, in the curt, suspicious nods from the store owner in the nearest dusty town, in the sudden silence that descended whenever he entered a room. The curiosity quickly soured into judgment, then hardened into open hostility. He was a black man, living alone, a veteran of a war that had freed his people, but left their social standing deeply precarious. Now, he was housing white children, a fact that twisted into sinister implications in the prejudiced minds of his neighbors. Stereotypical societal figures emerged from the shadows of rumor, the self-righteous preacher who spoke of unnatural arrangements and the corruption of the innocent, the land speculator who eyed Elias's productive, albeit modest, claim with covetous greed, seeing an opportunity in the manufactured scandal, the resentful farmer barely scraping by, who viewed Elias's small prosperity with envy and resentment, now fueled by racial animosity. Their words, unspoken or muttered, were sharper than any blade. He felt their eyes on him, a palpable weight of condemnation, a silent chorus of suspicion that amplified the already immense pressure of his new, unwanted responsibilities. The children, unaware of the storm they had unwittingly unleashed, played quietly in the dust outside, their laughter a fragile defiance against the unspoken threats. Elias saw the danger clearly, a stark landscape mirroring the harshness of the human heart. He knew with a soldier's grim certainty that he was no longer just protecting 9 abandoned souls. He was protecting them and himself from a world determined to see the worst in every good intention, from a society that would rather see him fail than thrive, especially if that thriving involved a moral act they could not comprehend. The children, initially a silent, homogeneous mass of despair, slowly began to unfurl themselves, each revealing a sliver of their lost past, a fragile echo of the family they had left behind. The eldest, a girl named Sarah, barely 12, carried the weight of her younger siblings like a shroud. Her eyes, still wide with a lingering terror, would occasionally meet Elias's, not with fear, but with a surprising quiet resolve. She spoke little, her words sparse and measured like polished river stones, but her every action was a stark testament to the ordeal they had endured. Through her clipped sentences, Elias began to piece together fragments of their journey. A wagon accident, a sickness that took their parents, the gradual abandonment by others who found the burden too great. The details were vague, like half-remembered nightmares, but the raw, brutal truth of their aloneness was undeniably clear. He saw in their small, tentative steps, their hesitant smiles when he managed to scrounge up a piece of dried fruit, a resilience he recognized from his own hard-fought life. The smallest one, a baby girl named Lily, would often reach out with tiny, unbidden fingers, grasping his calloused thumb, a simple, trusting gesture that pierced through the layers of his hardened exterior. It was a dangerous warmth, this creeping affection, a vulnerability he had long ago purged from his emotional arsenal. He had learned to keep things at arm's length, to maintain a safe distance from the chaos of human attachment. Yet, with each passing day, the distance between them, between him and these vulnerable children, seemed to shrink, replaced by an invisible thread, thin but incredibly strong. The tension, however, did not dissipate. It merely shifted, from the immediate threat of their arrival to the simmering danger of their continued presence. He had taken them in, yes, but what then? What would become of them and of him, trapped in this isolated crucible, surrounded by a world that watched, judged, and waited for him to fail? The cabin, once a haven of solitary routine, now pulsed with the restless energy of 9 small lives, each demanding in their own silent ways a share of Elias's dwindling resources and his even more precious, more limited patience. Food became a constant, gnawing concern. His meager stores, meant for one man and soon one woman, vanished with alarming speed. He hunted with a desperation he hadn't known since his days on campaign, every shot a prayer, every successful kill a momentary reprieve from the specter of starvation. The children, unused to the harsh diet of dried meat and sparse vegetables, often fell ill, their small bodies racked by fevers and coughs, their cries echoing through the quiet nights, a relentless testament to their fragility. He became an amateur nurse, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, as he administered crude poultices and brewed bitter teas. Sleep became a luxury, a fleeting phantom that danced just beyond his reach. He would sit by the hearth, watching the embers glow, listening to the shallow breathing of the sleeping children, the stark reality of his new life pressing down on him like a physical weight. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in on him, each creak of the wood a reminder of the relentless burden. He resented them, deeply and fiercely, for shattering his peace, for forcing him to confront a softness he believed long dead. He longed for the simple quiet of his previous existence, for the anticipation of his bride, for a future that now seemed irrevocably lost. But then a small hand would reach out in the darkness, a whimper would escape a fevered lip, and something inside him, a reluctant, grudging compassion, would stir. It was a terrifying sensation, this insidious erosion of his self-imposed detachment. He was a man accustomed to the stark, clear lines of duty and survival. This confusing, demanding tangle of lives, was a wilderness he had never navigated, a test of character far more profound than any battle he had ever fought. The knock came at dusk, not a gentle rap, but a series of sharp, authoritative blows that rattled the very timbers of the cabin. Elias knew instinctively who it was. Silas Thorne, the self-appointed moral compass of the nearest settlement, accompanied by 2 of his stooges, their faces grim, their eyes narrowed with self-righteous condemnation. Thorne was a man of the cloth, or so he claimed, but his words were often sharp-edged weapons, wielded with a terrifying certainty. He stood framed in the doorway, a looming silhouette against the dying light, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Vance," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "we've heard stories, unnatural ones." His gaze swept past Elias, piercing into the dim interior where the children huddled, their eyes wide with fear. "These children, they are not your kind. This is not right. It is a perversion, an affront to God's order." Elias felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the old soldier's anger, dormant for so long, now coiling like a viper. He had faced down men like Thorne before, men whose piety was a flimsy cloak for their prejudice, whose righteousness was a cover for their fear of anything that defied their narrow understanding of the world. "They are children," Elias stated, his voice low, deceptively calm. "Abandoned. They needed shelter." Thorne scoffed, a dismissive sound that grated on Elias's ears. A black man with white children, it breeds suspicion. It breeds a sin. He took a step forward, an unspoken threat in his stance. "We demand you hand them over. They will be placed with proper families, white families." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a demand for Elias to conform, to surrender, to admit his place. But as Elias looked back at the small, terrified faces peering from the shadows, a strange, fierce resolve solidified within him. This was not about right or wrong in the eyes of men like Thorne. This was about something far more fundamental. This was about defiance, about a fragile humanity, and about choosing, finally, to stand firm against the relentless tide of a world determined to crush anything beautiful or unexpected. The storm broke with a fury that mirrored the tempest raging within Elias. A chilling night wind, sharp as a whip, howled through the cabin's cracks, followed by a sudden driving sleet that plastered against the windows like a desperate hand. Little Lily, the infant, began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that quickly escalated into a rasping gasp. Her skin was feverish to the touch, her breathing shallow and ragged. Elias's heart, long a hardened, impenetrable stone, lurched with a terrifying pang. He remembered the fever that had claimed his younger sister, a memory he had buried deep, a wound that had never truly healed. Panic, a sensation he rarely allowed himself to indulge, clawed at him. He worked feverishly, trying to warm her, to make her breathe easier, but the crude remedies he possessed seemed useless against the relentless grip of the illness. Sarah, her face etched with fear, sat beside him, her small hands clutching Lily's, a silent plea for a miracle. Outside, the world was a blur of icy wind and relentless sleet, isolating them further, cutting them off from any hope of help. In that desperate, suffocating moment, a profound transformation occurred within Elias. The bitterness, the resentment, the stubborn desire for his old solitary life, all of it sloughed away like old skin. He saw not a burden, not an inconvenience, but a tiny, flickering life, utterly dependent on him, utterly helpless. He saw his sister's face, etched onto Lily's, and a long-buried wellspring of tenderness, of fierce, protective love, surged through him, overwhelming all else. He would not lose her. He could not lose her. His very soul cried out against the thought. He gathered Lily close, her small body burning against his, and began to whisper, not prayers, for he was not a praying man, but promises, fierce and unyielding, to a child who might never hear them. In that cabin, isolated by the storm and by the world's prejudice, the retired soldier, the flawed, morally ambiguous man, finally, fully, became a father, not by blood, but by an act of profound, agonizing, and utterly selfless will. The future he had anticipated, the bride he had longed for, faded into the background, eclipsed by the immediate, overwhelming reality of life and death in his arms. The dawn, when it finally broke, was not a violent explosion of light, but a hesitant, muted gray, painting the landscape in shades of weary resilience. Lily's breathing, though still shallow, had eased, the fever having mercifully broken in the pre-dawn hours. Elias, slumped by the hearth, felt the profound exhaustion of a man who had wrestled with death and, for this brief, fragile moment, emerged victorious. His eyes, rimmed with red, held a new depth, a different kind of light. The future, once a clear path leading to a singular anticipated arrival, had splintered into a multitude of uncertain roads, each winding through the vast, unpredictable terrain of care and responsibility. The image of his bride, once so vivid, had receded, becoming a soft focus memory, a ghost of a life that might have been. He felt no resentment, only a profound, almost painful acceptance. His hands, still bearing the faint scent of feverish child and bitter herbs, now felt less like instruments of war and more like tools of nurturing, capable of a tenderness he had never fully understood. The children, stirring in their makeshift beds, looked at him with an unspoken trust, a quiet understanding that bypassed words. His cabin, once a symbol of his solitary defiance against a world that sought to diminish him, now hummed with a different kind of life, a chaotic symphony of childish whispers and the soft rustle of movement. It was not the peace he had envisioned, nor the solitude he had craved, but a new, complex kind of existence, fraught with challenge yet brimming with a fragile, hard-won hope. The retired Buffalo soldier, who had waited for his bride, found instead a larger, more demanding, yet ultimately more fulfilling purpose. The world outside, with its prejudices and its harsh judgments, still waited, but within the walls of his humble home, a new kind of family forged in the crucible of abandonment and desperate need had begun to take root, a testament to the unexpected, often painful, and profoundly transformative power of human connection.